Welcome, Mark. Stage is yours.
Thank you. So, in preparation, I turned on the same song when I got out of the shower today. My wife is with me here. She was not as enthusiastic. I'll keep trying it. So, today I'm going to talk about incident response and specifically what you can do to prepare before an incident occurs. And I'm not talking about security controls or even specific technical things you can do, but practices, methodologies that you can implement and try now based on what you have. So not a very technical talk, and I'm not a big fan of presentations that say, this is a forward to a blog or a white paper that's going to be released, but I'm going to do that now. And the reason I say that is some of the slides have a lot of content on them, a lot of words. If you want to take a picture, that's cool, but we will release a framework and a white paper that will have this in more depth. So if you don't want to try to remember all of it now, you can reference that later. So I think it's important to start out with the goals of incident response. And this topic in general is focused on industrial control systems, but it can be translated over to IT systems as well. Some of the core methodologies and the goals are the same between the two. And we can't really talk about incident response and security controls without regulation in some form. Coming from the United States, most of our industrial control systems are privately owned and operated, but heavily regulated by the government. I know that isn't the case across the globe, and we've worked with some international companies and partners that don't have those same guidelines, but I think it's worth bringing up. So, three kind of core goals for incident response. I classify them as quarantine, operational resilience, and minimizing future incidents. The most important in ICS, in my mind, is that operational resilience. And I define that as the expedited, economical, safe return to stable state. That is the ultimate goal. With regulation, the goals kind of feed into those for incident response on prevent, prepare, and report. The problem is, I think our current regulation and compliance guidelines create some shortfalls that are consistent across the industry. So taking a quick look at some of the regulation. In the United States, if we talk about nuclear power, we have NRC, which is an independent government agency. They are ultimately responsible for anyone that does processing or pre-processing of fuel and has a commercial offering in that space. Once that power gets transferred to high voltage for transmission or distribution, then it falls under FERC, which is another government agency. FERC has to assign what's called an Electric Reliability Organization, or ERO, and they assign that to NERC. And within NERC, there is Critical Infrastructure Protection, which is NERC-CIP. So from nuclear power being generated down to distributed to the homes, there are multiple government agencies that have oversight and can define regulation in that space. If we take a look at some of those policies, and they all differ a little bit, but they follow the same general verbiage here. And if we look at some of the initial terms, maintain the capability, mitigate consequences, correct vulnerabilities, and restore affected systems, those are all kind of high, they're lofty, they're somewhat arbitrary. The first bullet there says timely detection. That's a subjective adverb. What is timely? Is it 24 hours? Is it a week? And I think the problem with this is that it opens the door to the guidelines being interpreted. It's open to the asset owners trying to realize the intent of the policy. And that's good. It's good that these are somewhat arbitrary because the networks are unique. They're not consistent. Incident response at the generation site is not going to be necessarily the same at transmission distribution. They have different vendors, the network topology is completely different, and really the guidelines, or rather the regulations, can be viewed as guidelines. It's a starting point, a list of goals that an organization can do. We've done some engagements in parts of the world that don't have regulation over this space. And the asset owners say, we have money, we have resources, we want to do the right thing, we don't know what that is. And so in that regard, I think government regulations, compliance is good. I think it's negative in the fact that, again, it's open to intent and interpretation. And this can be either intentional or non-intentional. I myself am guilty, previous life, working in an area with government regulation that said we had to have antivirus on a network. It wasn't practical with the network we were working with. We didn't have standard Windows boxes. We did some compiling of code, and so we needed those CPU cycles. And so we stood up an antivirus box, a server, stuck it over in a corner of the network, and didn't deploy a single agent. Could we check the box? Yes. And that's exactly what we did. And that was more efficient than trying to work through the regulation to get a variance to that and get the approvals and the processes. And so we did what we needed based on our resources. Also, malicious compliance. I think sometimes if it's non-intentional, I think a good example of that is a firewall or proxy deployment. I've worked with some clients where they call us in for incident response, and we say, do you have a firewall? Yes. Do you have logging enabled? Yes. We get on site, and the retention for the firewall is 15 minutes or half an hour. We called it a first-in, all-out configuration. And that's not that the customer didn't know what they were doing, they just didn't understand the technology they were deploying. Logging enabled to them meant check the box, log this, yes. Did they have retention on the server? Did they have appropriate resources to retain the logs? No. Some regulation specifies that retention time. Especially in the healthcare industry, you have to retain logs for so long, but that doesn't translate everywhere. If you deploy a proxy, is it set up in transparent mode? Is it doing anything, or do you just have a proxy deployed to check the box? I think, especially when we talk about incident response and trying to identify forensic artifacts, if I deploy a proxy and it's doing network address translation, it's masquerading all of those lower level IPs. So do I have it deployed? Yes. Is it beneficial for incident response? No, it's actually counterproductive. I think in the same regard of regulation being a list of goals and starting points, it is a minimum. It's not the same idea of a speed limit. This is the fastest you can go. This is the bare minimum. And unfortunately, the documents carry an audit and a fine weight with them. It's very common for government agencies that are ultimately responsible for ensuring that those operating in this space meet those guidelines, and so they do routine audits. And failing an audit can be very, very expensive. The documents also are very static. They're not meant to be living documents. As we all know, getting more than one policymaker in a room and trying to have them decide on something is very, very difficult. So these documents are stood up, authorized, and signed, and meant to last for several years. And so they're generally not as up to date. So, keeping in mind that regulation is kind of a starting point in this space and where a lot of people focus, I think the two main shortfalls that come out of this are root cause analysis is not really accounted for or identified. I didn't see it called out in any of the government regulatory documents that I reviewed. A lot of times they will specify lessons learned. But what is lessons learned? Is that part of the IR process? Is that the technology behind that identifies forensic artifacts? Is it the forensic process? That isn't really accounted for. And then finally, as we all know here, being compliant does not mean you are secure. It doesn't mean you are prepared to handle an incident. I know lately the industry, IT and ICS, is trying to get away from what we call checkbox security. And that's exactly what this is. So with root cause analysis, and Mark before me mentioned this as well, that the most common infection vector in ICS is still unknown. I think part of that is because we don't do a good job communicating between the OT and the IT networks. So something happened on the OT side and it makes the news and we get aware of it. But from an internal company perspective, do they communicate to the IT group? Do they say, we saw this infection vector come from the IT network, let's work with the IT group and figure out the real root infection vector. Was it phishing? Was it something open to the web? And what makes the news is just the OT side of that, not necessarily the root cause what happened on the IT side. There are multiple reports out, and statistics are fun that way, that identify what's the average time to detect an incident. The example I put up here, I believe it says 206 days, with the recommendation that it is identified within the first 100 days. These are all kind of fuzzy numbers. You could find a report that says more or less. In this example, they call out identification of an infection within 100 days would cost roughly $6 million, and anything above that goes to 8.7 or plus. Really, it's straightforward, and we all understand that the sooner you detect an incident, the more success you'll have in your response capabilities. But I think that bleeds over to incident response or root cause analysis and why it's so difficult. If I'm looking to return to service, I have to identify what the malware is doing, what changes were made on the system, and that's generally a week to a day of analysis in logs. If I'm looking for a root infection vector and I was compromised a year ago, now I need to look at logs going back a year, which means I have to have the resources to retain that as well as the staff to look at that amount of traffic. In this space, we're also dealing with custom hardware, proprietary firmware that may not have logging enabled at all. When we talk about access to the data, that could be technical or it could be physical. We've worked with some renewable energy clients that have wind farms that span multiple states across the United States. So if I have 2 turbines that are acting odd and I'm not aggregating those logs somewhere, I have to deploy a resource that understands using write blockers and doing forensics on that type of turbine, and it may take them a day and a half to travel to each one of those sites. Visibility retention is difficult in the space, and I think it's worth noting that root cause analysis should be the end goal, but it's not always possible. If you were compromised 6 months or a year ago, and your firewall retention is 15 minutes, you're not going to identify root cause. From the compliance not equating to being secure prepared, I think the Target compromise in the United States in 2013 is a good example of that. Target is a large retailer in the US. They were compromised, I think it was around 2013. And one of the odd results of that was 2 banks sued Target, as well as the company Target hired to give them compliance. So to handle credit card and financial processing in the US, you have to be certified in PCI. And the banks didn't just sue Target, but they sued the company that gave Target PCI compliance, the authority to operate. I think that's very interesting because the company claimed Target was authorized. They gave them the compliance check. The bank's lawsuit claimed that Target was not doing the bare minimum for the industry. And so they sued both companies. I believe it was 2016, somewhere around there. Lloyd's of London and the University of Cambridge did a large study where they were trying to look at the economic impact of a large electric outage in the United States. And they did a very thorough review over 3 scenarios that looked at total impact to GDP, and more interesting, on the bottom right here, is the impact to other verticals and other sectors. And so you'll see manufacturing up there. Again, as Mark noticed, in the US, we love to put important things on the grid, but households is up here as well. And so they looked at the impact to say, if there was a large outage, would that electric company be liable in a lawsuit form for household impact? If people lose power, they lose refrigeration, you may lose access to your pacemaker or inability to keep medicine cold. And so the financial impacts were huge. This study didn't account for whether or not the electric utility was compliant. I assume they were, because if they're operating in this space, that means that they're being routinely audited by the government agencies that have oversight in that area, but it didn't stop from these billions and billions of dollars of impact. So I think a good starting point is to ask some questions. If you're not sure where to start, some key thoughts that may guide you, or if you feel like you're prepared. One of Mark's questions that they put up on the survey was, do you think you could detect an attack now? If you said, yes, you could detect it, that's great. Detection is key. The response or return to service. I think these are good questions to ask yourself in response to that. The first one being, when is IR justified? We do a lot of tabletops with companies. And during a tabletop, we print out their incident response plan, and we have it sitting on the table next to them, and everyone goes into the exercise knowing you're going to test that. It's different in the real world. If the security operations center gets 2 calls from someone who says their email, or they got some weird email and they clicked on the link, and someone else calls and says their computer is acting slow, and the OT side of the house has a failed controller, at what point is all of that information aggregated together and you declare, now we're starting incident response? It's much more cloudy in the real world. I've seen multiple approaches to this. One of them is based on the number of assets. So if more than 10 IT assets, then we have an incident. Or on the ICS side, anything in the OT network that is impacted or starts acting weird launches some incident response effort, and that's either based on the network or on the Purdue model. And going back to one of Mark's questions, when do you monitor versus remediate? I think that leads into the second question here on what if the resources are under active command and control? I think this is a key issue in the ICS space. Your response is substantially different if the actor has a hand in the network. If you alert them that they may be, or that you may be on to their motives or you're aware of their presence, they could launch kill disk or ransomware. They could try to clean up their efforts. And that goes back to the ultimate question in incident response on, at what point do I know enough about the compromise that I can begin remediating? Shutdown of operations. I've not yet seen an incident response plan or an emergency response plan where that is clearly identified, and that's okay. Maybe it's a decision made by senior management. But if we think back to the Lloyds of London exercise, if you shut down operations, you may recover from the cyber incident, but the liabilities may be so high that you can't operate further afterwards because the cost can be worth more than what your company is worth. Incident response differs from emergency response. In some sectors, like nuclear energy, there is no difference between incident and emergency. And so you may not have to redefine the escalation process, who's notified, and some of those key decisions. You can just tie it into your emergency response. How do you operate if the report data can't be trusted? One thing about Trisys is that the firmware on the safety system was modified. If we see these controllers or reporting services that are reporting up to your HMI or your SCADA or your historians, and we can't trust the data, how do we handle that? Do you have the resources to disperse out knowledgeable people to do forensics on those devices directly? And then really the core question is, do you have what you need to investigate root cause analysis? And you should ask the technical people in your organization that are doing this. Say, if we had, let's start with something straightforward. If you had ransomware, could you identify root cause analysis and have them walk through the process? Well, we'd need to identify the mode of access and then follow that chain up, and that kind of goes into the root cause analysis challenges. So what can you do to improve? I really focus on 3 key areas. Gather information. This goes to the old adage of know thyself. Generate playbooks, and then build contracted service relationships. So in gathering data, when we sign on a new incident response retention client, one of the first things that we do is send them kind of a welcome package and a list of questions about their network that we want them to answer. Some of the initial points are straightforward, points of contact, who's authorized to initiate incident response, and really what we're after is information about their network, information about the infrastructure. I did incident response in the IT space for about 7 years, and in ICS for 2. And I've yet to walk into an environment and ask for a network diagram and have them say, yes, this is updated, here you go. It's always some engineer that worked there 5 years ago that put it together and now it's outdated, if they have anything. So a basic network topology graph is a great place to start. We all know we should have one, but nobody does. Does anyone claim to here? A couple hands I won't acknowledge because it's counteractive to my message. But that's a great point to start. And within that, identify points of access. How do you access the network? What are all the ingress-egress points? You may think you know them now, but I'm sure there are vendor connections out there that under the warranty or agreement with the vendor, they have direct access. Are you accounting for those? Do you know about them? Security controls. If doing incident response on the network, and I'm not familiar with the network because I don't operate directly in that space, where can I go for those forensic artifacts? Where are the firewalls? Where are the proxies? What is that retention time? Map that out. Primary ICS vendors, and then, of course, operating requirements. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the following presentation, but taking a formalized approach to what data is in the network, and when I say data, I'm talking about the infrastructure, logs, retention, things that could be used for incident response or forensic investigations, and formalizing that into what we call a collection management framework, or a CMF. And Ben and I will talk a little bit about that. And then finally, generating playbooks. Playbooks is a new term I've heard quite a bit over the past year, and we take the same approach at Dragos. We have some more documentation available on our website about this, but really the key goal is the first 15 minutes. How do I help the junior analyst or whoever sees that first alert get started gathering data? With incident response, we all know a lot of that data is volatile. It can be overwritten, either based on time or me interacting with the machine if I don't know what I'm doing. So having a playbook, having a quick snippet to get the junior analyst to start working towards remediation or at least gathering logs is very beneficial. Within that playbook, you can do triage techniques. A good example, I think, is encrypted traffic. So we talk to a lot of people on analyzing RDP, and they say, well, it's encrypted. I can't do anything with it. Well, sure you can. RDP, the keyboard language, is exchanged before the data is encrypted. Even if it's SSH or some other encrypted protocol, you have analysis you can do on time deviations. Is it the same byte count or payload size going ingress and egress every time? Is the session duration and time between the sessions consistent? That's somewhat indicative of a service rather than a human. Ultimate goal being, again, do I have someone with active command and control in my network, or am I dealing with an automated process or service? And data of interest. What logs do I need to gather? It would be great if we as an industry had a playbook for all of these different primary vendors out there. If I see something happening weird on an ABB device, and I'm a junior analyst and I see that, where can I go? What logs are available and how do I get those out? I think I never liked the exercise that some people have to do in school to say, tell me how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich if I don't understand what bread or peanut butter or jelly is. That's a useful exercise in documentation, and it's easy for playbooks to kind of take that same approach. I would counter against that and say keep it succinct, keep them small. If I'm in a true incident and people are running around crazy, as they tend to do, I'm not going to read 5 pages. I'm going to skim a paragraph. And within that paragraph, hopefully I can identify some triage techniques, maybe point me to other resources, identify where the data of interest is, and under a best case scenario, identify best practices. Under bulleted here, we have, if it's an external box, don't connect or scan it. If there's volatile data, don't connect to the device directly. I think one of the most common shortfalls I see in incident response is when someone thinks a box is compromised, they connect to it with a service account so they can see what's going on the box. Well, the box is compromised and you just connected to it with something with domain admin potentially. So best practices and then prioritizing that. Where to start with playbooks? If it sounds interesting to you, you're not sure where to begin, start with the routine instances. When your SOC or when your analysts come in the morning on Monday, after they drink their coffee, what do they look at? If a light turns red, what do they do? Get some of the senior people to start documenting what they do that is routine, so when they're not there, junior analysts can take it. And then finally, build relationships with the either vendors or contracted services that you have. Some of the skills needed for incident response, reverse engineering, host forensics, those are very expensive to retain. And hopefully you don't have to use them that often. If you do contract those out to a third party, I really encourage you not to just pay for it and sit quiet. Be engaged with them through the process. One thing that we do at Dragos is offer to sit down and review their incident response plan, compare that to best practices, stand up a day tabletop exercise, take a couple hours out of the IR retainer and engage with them. Over in the United States, we have a federally run program that's like a very large tabletop exercise that runs for a couple days in the electric sector called GridX. And we have multiple clients that encourage us to work GridX with them, and we're happy to do that. Identify some of those key questions, like if they have to go on site. Do they need physical access? Do they need background checks? Do they need specific NERC training? Get that out of the way now. Some of those logistical questions really delay the launch of the incident response process, and it is incredibly frustrating as an asset owner. I've seen it many times to have an IR team come in and you lose a day and a half because they need to get badges or they need to take mandatory training. So get that out of the way. The other big question I would say is how that outside party interacts with your network. I've worked cases where we can plug our devices right into the network and access their security controls directly. I've worked other cases where we can't touch a keyboard at all and we're standing behind someone telling them where to click. We're happy to work with whatever you guys are allowed to, but have that identified beforehand. One thing that I've seen work very well is if we can't plug our machines into your network, or if you won't let the third-party vendor do that, then identify what tools they need to be successful and go buy a laptop and build it with those tools and stick it in a cabinet. Once a year, update it. The whole idea being once they hit the ground, you can give them the resources they need to begin working. Seems very simple, seems very straightforward, but I've seen it come up a lot over the past couple of years. That is the majority of that presentation. I think we've got about 12 minutes, and I believe we're going to save questions until the end with Ben and I.